Say that again. The billionaire's voice cracked through the restaurant so suddenly that every fork stopped halfway to every mouth. The pianist near the marble staircase missed a note. Crystal glasses trembled softly beneath the amber lights. And for one impossible second, the entire rooftop dining room of Bellamy's in downtown Chicago forgot how to breathe. Naomi Carter froze beside table 12, a silver tray balanced carefully in one hand, steam rising from a plate of sea bass in the other. She blinked once, confused, as dozens of wealthy strangers slowly turned toward her. Alexander Whitmore was already standing. 6'3", silver-haired, dressed in a charcoal Brioni suit that probably cost more than Naomi's monthly rent. The billionaire founder of Whitmore Global looked nothing like a man who lost control. But his hand was shaking. Badly. A thin stream of 12-year bourbon dripped from the edge of the crystal glass he had just dropped onto the white tablecloth. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because men like Alexander Whitmore did not shake. They did not stare. And they definitely did not look at a waitress like they had just seen a ghost. Naomi swallowed carefully. "Sir?" she asked softly. But Alexander barely heard her. His eyes were locked on her face with the kind of disbelief usually reserved for miracles or funerals. 20 years. 20 years of private investigators. 20 years of dead leads, fake reports, missing children databases, DNA searches, and sleepless nights staring at a tiny pink bracelet locked inside a vault in his penthouse office. 20 years since the fire. Since the smoke. Since the little girl he called his little queen disappeared from his arms forever. And now this waitress had just spoken the exact same sentence his daughter used to whisper every time he burned himself cooking pancakes on Sunday mornings. "Careful," she had giggled back then in her tiny little voice. Hot plates burn faster than pride. Alexander's chest tightened so violently it almost stole the air from his lungs. Naomi shifted uncomfortably beneath the stairs. She hated moments like this. Rich people always found new ways to make service workers feel small. Usually it was snapping fingers. Sometimes it was fake smiles and comments about diversity hires whispered just loud enough to sting. Tonight had already been exhausting. A double shift. 3 rude customers. Feet aching inside black non-slip shoes that had seen better days. And now one of the richest men in America was staring at her like she had just crawled out of his memories. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked again, trying to stay professional. But Alexander stepped closer instead. Slowly, like a man approaching something sacred. His blue eyes moved from her face to the silver chain around her neck. Naomi instinctively touched it. The old necklace rested against her skin, worn thin with age. A tiny gold crown hung from the chain, scratched and faded after years of use. She had worn it for as long as she could remember. "Where did you get that?" Alexander whispered. The room was so quiet, even the jazz music sounded distant now. Naomi frowned slightly. "It was my mother's," she answered automatically, though the truth was more complicated than that. She didn't actually know whose necklace it had been. Her grandmother had given it to her when she was little and refused to explain where it came from. Alexander's face lost color instantly, because engraved on the back of that tiny crown, hidden beneath years of scratches and time, were 3 words he had commissioned himself 20 years ago for his missing daughter. "My little queen." Naomi felt every eye in Bellamy's pressing against her skin like heat from an open oven. Wealthy investors in tailored suits stared openly now. Their conversations dissolved into whispers beneath the soft glow of the rooftop chandeliers. Somewhere near the grand piano, a woman lowered her champagne glass without taking a sip. Another guest quietly reached for his phone beneath the table. Naomi hated this feeling, being watched without understanding why. Alexander Whitmore stood motionless only a few feet away, his breathing uneven, his eyes fixed on the small crown necklace trembling slightly against Naomi's black uniform. The powerful billionaire who dominated magazine covers and stock markets suddenly looked older than his. 48 years. Not weak, just tired, deeply tired, like a man carrying something too heavy for too long. Naomi instinctively stepped back. "Sir, I think you are mistaken," she said carefully, keeping her voice calm even as her pulse quickened. "I should get your manager." But Alexander shook his head immediately. No, the word came out too fast, too desperate. It startled even him. He softened his tone, lowering his voice almost to a whisper. "Please." Naomi frowned slightly. Nobody ever said please to waitresses in places like this. Not men like him. Especially not men surrounded by senators, executives, and private security teams standing near the elevators downstairs. Alexander swallowed hard, his eyes drifting once more toward the necklace. 20 years ago, he had held that same tiny gold crown in the palm of his hand while his daughter sat on the marble kitchen counter, kicking her little legs and laughing at his terrible pancakes. He remembered every detail. The smell of maple syrup, the sunlight through the windows, the tiny gap between her front teeth when she smiled. People said memory faded with time. They lied. The painful memories stayed sharpest of all. "Where is your family?" he asked quietly. Naomi hesitated. Something about the question felt too personal, too intimate for strangers standing in the middle of a crowded restaurant. "I was raised by my grandmother," she answered cautiously. "She passed away last spring." Alexander closed his eyes briefly as if the words physically hurt him. "And your parents?" Naomi looked away for the first time. "I do not know." Silence spread again. Heavy. Uncomfortable. The skyline outside the massive glass windows shimmered with rain-soaked Chicago lights, while thunder rolled faintly somewhere far across Lake Michigan. Naomi shifted the tray in her hands, suddenly aware of how strange this entire moment felt. "Sir, with respect, I think you are confusing me with someone else." Alexander stared at her like he wanted to believe that. Like life would somehow be easier if she were wrong. But then Naomi brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and his entire body stiffened. There it was. A tiny, crescent-shaped birthmark just beneath her left ear, barely visible beneath the warm lighting. Alexander's knees nearly gave out. The same mark. The exact same mark his daughter had carried since birth. He remembered kissing that tiny mark goodnight when she was little. Remembered calling it her moon kiss. Naomi noticed his expression immediately. "Sir?" she asked nervously. But Alexander was no longer hearing the restaurant. The music had disappeared. The voices had disappeared. Even the city outside had disappeared. Because after 20 years of searching through hospitals, orphanages, foster records, and graves, the impossible was standing in front of him, holding a silver serving tray. And for the first time in decades, Alexander Whitmore felt something he had stopped allowing himself to feel. Hope. Hope was a dangerous thing. Alexander Whitmore had learned that lesson 20 years ago standing outside a burning brownstone on the south side of Chicago, while firefighters carried out smoke and silence instead of answers. Hope was what destroyed men when reality failed them. That was why he stopped believing in miracles a long time ago. And yet somehow, standing inside Bellamy's beneath the warm rooftop lights, staring at the young black waitress with his daughter's necklace and his daughter's birthmark, he felt his carefully controlled world beginning to crack apart. Naomi noticed the change immediately. The billionaire looked pale now, almost unsteady, like the room itself had tilted beneath him. Guests nearby whispered openly, confused by the strange scene unfolding beside table 12. One older investor leaned toward another and muttered, "What the hell is happening to Whitmore?" But Alexander barely heard any of it. His entire focus remained fixed on Naomi. The way she tilted her head slightly when nervous. The calm steadiness in her voice. Even the small crease between her brows when she felt uncomfortable. Tiny details. Familiar details. Details his memory had protected like sacred relics for 2 decades. Naomi shifted her weight carefully, trying not to panic. "Sir," she said softly, "I think maybe you should sit down." Alexander almost laughed at the irony of it. For years, presidents had waited for him to sit first before entering negotiations. Entire boardrooms adjusted themselves around his moods. But this waitress, this young woman carrying a serving tray and wearing worn black shoes, was suddenly the only person in the room who sounded grounded. "What is your birthday?" he asked quietly. Naomi blinked. "Excuse me. Please." His voice lowered again, fragile in a way nobody there had probably ever witnessed before. "Tell me your birthday." Naomi hesitated. Everything about this interaction felt wrong now. Too emotional. Too personal. But something inside Alexander's eyes stopped her from walking away. It was not arrogance. It was not obsession. It looked like grief. The kind grief leaves behind after sitting inside someone for years. "October 17th, she answered cautiously. Alexander inhaled sharply. "October 17th. Exactly right." His fingers curled slowly against the edge of the table beside him. Naomi noticed his knuckles trembling. That is impossible, he whispered to himself. Across the room, the restaurant manager finally began approaching nervously, clearly worried about disturbing one of the most powerful men in America. Mr. Whitmore, the manager said carefully, forcing a polite smile. Is everything all right this evening? Alexander never looked away from Naomi. Leave us. The manager froze immediately. Sir, I said leave us. Not loud, not angry, somehow worse. The kind of calm authority that made billion-dollar companies move overnight. The manager nodded quickly and backed away without another word. Naomi stared at Alexander in disbelief. You cannot just do that, she said quietly. To her surprise, Alexander's expression softened slightly for the first time all evening. I know, he answered, but people usually let me anyway. Something about the honesty in that sentence caught her off guard. Wealthy men normally hid behind polished speeches and fake charm. But this sounded painfully real. Naomi slowly lowered the tray onto a nearby service stand, suddenly aware her hands were shaking too. Look, she said gently, I am sorry for whatever happened to your daughter. Truly. But I am not her. Alexander's eyes filled instantly with something deeper than sadness. Regret. That is what I told myself the first 5 times I found someone who almost matched, he admitted quietly. Same eyes, same age, same city. Every lead ended the same way. His jaw tightened slightly before he looked at her necklace once more. But none of them wore that crown. Thunder rolled again beyond the glass windows while rain began streaking softly across the Chicago skyline. And for the first time in her life, Naomi felt a strange feeling growing inside her chest. Not recognition. Not yet. But something close to it. Like hearing the faint echo of a song she had forgotten years ago. Rain tapped softly against the massive rooftop windows like fingertips on glass, while Bellamy's slowly tried to return to normal around them. Waiters resumed carrying trays. Investors forced awkward conversations back to life. The piano began playing again, though quieter now, uncertain somehow. But the strange gravity surrounding Alexander Whitmore and Naomi Carter remained untouched, like the entire center of the restaurant existed inside its own separate world. Naomi could still feel people staring every few seconds. Some with curiosity, others with irritation. Wealthy people hated scenes they did not control. She understood that much after 3 years serving downtown elites who treated kindness like an optional expense. But Alexander no longer seemed aware of any audience at all. His attention stayed locked on her with almost frightening intensity, as if looking away might cause her to disappear again. Naomi folded her arms slightly, trying to steady herself. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. Because if I am right. Alexander stopped himself, swallowing hard. His voice dropped lower. Then I lost my daughter for 20 years while the entire world watched me become successful instead of seeing I was broken. The words hit Naomi unexpectedly hard. Not because she believed him. She still did not. But because nobody spoke like that anymore. Not in places filled with money and polished smiles. People here talked about acquisitions, market shares, vacation homes in Aspen. Not grief. Never grief. Alexander slowly pulled a leather wallet from inside his suit jacket with visibly trembling hands. From a hidden sleeve inside, he removed an old photograph worn soft around the edges from years of being handled too often. He held it out carefully. Naomi hesitated before taking it. The second her eyes landed on the picture, her chest tightened. A little girl smiled brightly beside a younger Alexander Whitmore, standing near a lakeside dock beneath summer sunlight. She could not have been older than 4. Tiny braids, big eyes, a gold crown necklace hanging around her neck. The exact same necklace resting against Naomi's skin now. Naomi stared at the photograph too long. Long enough for something strange to stir deep inside her memory. Not a clear memory. More like fragments trapped beneath water. Warm sunlight. Laughter. A man lifting her onto his shoulders. The smell of pancakes. Naomi blinked hard, forcing herself back into the present. Lots of little girls wear necklaces, she said quickly, though her voice sounded weaker now. Alexander nodded once. Not custom-made ones. Naomi looked down again. On the back corner of the photograph, written in faded blue ink, were the words October 17th. Lake Geneva. Her stomach twisted unexpectedly. Lake Geneva. She had heard that place before. Somewhere. Somehow. But before she could think deeper, a sharp voice suddenly cut across the room. Naomi. She turned immediately. Vanessa, one of the senior servers, stood near the service station with obvious panic in her eyes. The manager wants you in the kitchen. Right now. Naomi glanced back toward Alexander uncertainly. I should go. Alexander's expression changed instantly, fear flashing across his face so fast it almost looked childish. Please do not leave. The vulnerability in his voice startled both of them. Naomi stared at him silently for a second. Men like Alexander Whitmore were supposed to inspire fear, not sympathy. Yet standing there beneath the amber lights with rain shadowing the skyline behind him, he no longer looked like America's most intimidating billionaire. He looked like a father terrified of losing something. Again, Naomi slowly handed back the photograph. I am not going anywhere, she said softly. Alexander closed his eyes briefly in relief, as though those 5 words alone had just kept him alive. But neither of them noticed the older woman standing near the far elevator, now frozen in place beside a housekeeping cart. Her gray hands gripped the handle tightly as tears slowly filled her eyes. Because after 20 years of silence, Evelyn Carter had just heard the name Alexander Whitmore spoken again. Evelyn Carter had spent 20 years preparing herself for this exact moment, and somehow she still was not ready. She stood frozen beside the service elevator in her pale housekeeping uniform, fingers trembling against the metal cart while rainwater glimmered across the rooftop windows behind her. Age had softened her posture and silvered her curls, but fear still lived inside her eyes exactly the same way it had 20 years ago. Across the restaurant, Naomi remained beside Alexander Whitmore, completely unaware that the woman who raised her was now only 30 feet away, struggling to breathe. Evelyn watched Alexander carefully. The expensive suit, the silver hair, the tired eyes she remembered far too well. Time had changed him, but grief had preserved certain things, especially the sadness. Evelyn recognized that sadness immediately because she carried her own version of it every single day. Miss Carter, Vanessa's nervous voice echoed again from the service station. The manager is seriously upset. Naomi looked torn now, trapped between responsibility and confusion. Bellamy's was not the kind of place where servers stopped working to comfort emotional billionaires in the middle of dinner service. But before Naomi could step away, Alexander suddenly spoke again. Your grandmother, he asked quietly. What was her name? Naomi hesitated. Evelyn Carter. The moment the words left her mouth, Alexander physically staggered backward as if somebody had struck him. Evelyn closed her eyes near the elevator. It was over. The secret she had buried for 20 years had finally found its way back into the light. Alexander stared at Naomi with disbelief flooding every line of his face. Evelyn Carter, he repeated softly. She worked at St. Mary's Medical Center. Naomi blinked in surprise. How do you know that? Alexander barely answered at first. His thoughts had already fallen backward through 2 decades of memory. St. Mary's. October 17th. Smoke. Sirens. A terrified nurse carrying a crying little girl wrapped in a blanket through crowded hospital corridors after the fire destroyed half the building next door. Evelyn Carter had been there that night. Young. Calm under pressure. Kind eyes. Alexander remembered because after the fire, when police could not find his daughter, Evelyn had been one of the last hospital workers who spoke to him before suddenly disappearing weeks later without explanation. Oh my God, Alexander whispered. Naomi frowned, anxiety beginning to replace confusion now. Sir, you are starting to scare me. Alexander immediately softened his expression. I am sorry, he said quietly, and he meant it. Truly, I do not want to frighten you. Nobody around them spoke anymore. Even the nearby diners had stopped pretending not to listen. Human beings were drawn to emotional truth the same way storms pulled lightning from the sky. And this moment carried too much truth to ignore. Naomi glanced toward the elevator area and suddenly froze. Evelyn stood there silently clutching the housekeeping cart, with tears streaming down her face. Naomi's expression changed instantly. Grandma, she whispered automatically before catching herself. The old woman slowly stepped forward. Every movement looked heavy somehow, burdened by 20 years of silence pressing against her shoulders. Alexander stared at her like a man seeing a ghost return from the dead. Evelyn stopped several feet away from them both, unable to fully lift her eyes. Rain shimmered against the glass behind her while the city lights blurred softly beneath the storm outside. You should have left Chicago years ago, she whispered shakily toward Alexander. Naomi looked between them in disbelief. Wait, you know each other? Neither answered immediately, because some truths become so large they silence everyone standing near them. Evelyn finally looked at Naomi, and the pain in her eyes nearly broke the young woman's heart before she even understood why. Baby, Evelyn whispered softly, there is something I should have told you a very long time ago. The air inside Bellamy's felt heavier now, thick with silence and rain and 20 years of buried truth struggling to breathe again. Naomi stared at Evelyn in complete disbelief, her fingers tightening unconsciously around the edge of the service tray beside her. The older woman had raised her, protected her, worked double shifts cleaning hotel rooms and hospital hallways just to keep food on the table. Evelyn Carter was the only family Naomi had ever truly known. And now she looked terrified. Not guilty. Terrified. That frightened Naomi more than anything else. What are you talking about? Naomi asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn opened her mouth once, then closed it again as tears rolled silently down her face. Across from them, Alexander Whitmore stood frozen beneath the amber chandelier lights, his entire world balanced on the edge of whatever came next. Wealth had taught him many things over the years. How to negotiate, how to dominate, how to survive betrayal in boardrooms filled with polished smiles. But grief had taught him something deeper. Sometimes the truth arrived slowly because the human heart needed time to survive it. Evelyn finally looked at Alexander. I never wanted this night to happen like this, she whispered shakily. Alexander's voice came low and rough. Then why did you disappear? The question hung between them like smoke. Naomi looked from one face to the other, confusion twisting harder inside her chest now. Someone needs to explain what is going on, she said firmly. And for the first time all evening, there was strength in her voice strong enough to steady the entire moment. Evelyn nodded slowly, wiping her trembling hands against the front of her housekeeping apron. 20 years ago, she began quietly, I worked overnight at St. Mary's Hospital. The fire downtown brought dozens of people into the emergency rooms that night. Families separated. Children crying. Smoke everywhere. Naomi listened silently, though. Something inside her chest had already started pounding harder. Not fear. Recognition. Like her body remembered something her mind still could not fully reach. Evelyn swallowed carefully. A little girl was brought and wrapped in a blanket. She was terrified. Could barely speak. Kept crying for her father. Alexander lowered his head slightly, eyes filling again. Naomi felt dizzy suddenly. Small flashes kept flickering through her thoughts now. Red lights reflecting against wet streets. Sirens. Warm arms lifting her. A lullaby somewhere far away. There were rumors. Evelyn continued softly. People said the fire was not accidental. Said powerful people connected to Whitmore Industries were being threatened back then. Your daughter disappearing made headlines overnight. Alexander's jaw tightened painfully. He remembered every second. Investors pulling away. Security investigations. Police interviews. News cameras camped outside his penthouse for months while the country watched his grief like entertainment. But none of that compared to waking up every morning without hearing his daughter laugh. Evelyn looked directly at Naomi now. I was supposed to transfer you to child services the next morning, she whispered. But that night, two men came asking questions about the little girl from the fire. They were not police. Naomi's breath caught. Alexander immediately stepped forward. You thought she was in danger. Evelyn nodded once. I did not know who to trust. Rain streaked harder against the windows outside, while distant thunder rolled over the city skyline. Naomi suddenly felt cold despite the warmth of the restaurant. So you took me, she whispered. Evelyn's tears fell faster now. I was only trying to protect you. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, the pain on his face impossible to hide anymore. 20 years. 20 years believing his daughter was gone forever, while she grew up only miles away carrying trays in restaurants where men like him ate dinner. The cruelness of it almost felt unreal. Naomi stared down at the tiny crown necklace resting against her chest. Suddenly, another memory flashed through her mind, clearer this time. A man kneeling beside her bed when she was little, gently fixing the same necklace clasp while smiling softly. My little queen, the memory whispered. Naomi's entire body froze. Because for the first time in her life, the voice in that memory finally had a face. The memory hit Naomi like warm light breaking through heavy clouds after years of darkness. Not complete, not perfect, just fragments. A deep voice humming softly beside her bed. Strong hands lifting her into the air while she laughed. The smell of cinnamon pancakes on Sunday mornings. And that sentence. Always that sentence. Good night, my little queen. Naomi's breath became uneven as she stared at Alexander Whitmore across the restaurant. The billionaire looked shattered now, standing completely exposed beneath the dim rooftop lights while rain blurred the Chicago skyline behind him. Gone was the polished executive the world feared. Gone was the billionaire whose face appeared on financial magazines and television screens. In his place stood a father staring at the child he thought he had buried in his heart 20 years ago. Naomi instinctively touched the necklace again, her fingers trembling against the tiny gold crown. I remember that voice, she whispered before she could stop herself. Alexander inhaled sharply like the words physically struck him. Evelyn covered her mouth quietly as tears rolled down her cheeks. Naomi closed her eyes for a second, trying to steady the storm building inside her chest. More flashes came now, tiny memories surfacing from somewhere deep and hidden. Sitting on a dock beside a lake, tiny hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate. A man laughing as he burned breakfast in a giant kitchen while pretending he meant to do it. None of the memories felt fake. That frightened her most of all. No, Naomi whispered softly, stepping backward. No, this cannot be real. But grief recognizes itself. And standing in front of Alexander Whitmore, Naomi suddenly understood why this stranger's sadness had felt familiar from the very beginning. Because some part of her had carried it too. The restaurant around them had completely disappeared into silence now. Guests openly watched with wide eyes while waiters stood frozen near the kitchen entrance pretending to polish glasses they had stopped touching minutes ago. Human beings understood emotional truth when they saw it. Even strangers. Especially strangers. Alexander took one careful step closer, his blue eyes filled with tears he no longer bothered hiding. Your mother used to sing to you every night before bed, he said quietly. Naomi froze instantly. What? Alexander's voice cracked softly. You hated thunderstorms when you were little, so she would sing Moon River until you fell asleep. Naomi's knees nearly gave out beneath her, because suddenly she could hear it. Faint, distant. A woman's soft voice somewhere far inside her memory, singing while rain tapped gently against windows. Naomi grabbed the edge of the nearby table for balance. How do you know that? She whispered. Alexander looked at her with the heartbreak of 20 stolen years sitting openly on his face. Because I sang it with her. Naomi turned sharply toward Evelyn. Tell me this is not true. Evelyn could barely speak through the tears now. Baby, I wanted to tell you so many times. Naomi shook her head immediately. Then why did you not? The pain in her voice cut through the restaurant harder than shouting ever could. Evelyn looked down at her trembling hands. Because I was afraid. Afraid of what? Evelyn finally lifted her eyes toward Alexander. The people connected to that fire never disappeared. They only became richer. A cold silence followed those words. Alexander's jaw tightened instantly. Naomi looked between them both, confusion and fear colliding inside her chest. What does that mean? Alexander answered quietly this time. It means your disappearance may not have been an accident. Thunder rolled again across the city while lightning briefly illuminated the rain-streaked windows surrounding Bellamy's rooftop dining room. Naomi suddenly felt the entire world shifting beneath her feet. All her life, she thought she was invisible. Just another black waitress carrying plates through rooms full of powerful people who never bothered learning her name. But tonight she was learning something terrifying. Powerful people had known her name all along. Naomi felt the room spinning around her, though nobody else seemed to move at all. The rain outside Bellamy's rooftop windows had grown heavier now, streaking silver against the glass, while distant lightning briefly illuminated the skyline beyond the Chicago River. Somewhere behind her, dishes clinked softly in the kitchen. A waiter dropped a fork. Nobody reacted, because every person inside that restaurant understood they were witnessing something larger than wealth or status or gossip. They were watching a lost family stumble toward each other after 20 years of silence. Naomi stared at Alexander Whitmore with tears gathering in her eyes despite every effort to stay composed. Her entire life had been built on uncertainty. No birth records. No real answers about where she came from. Just fragments. A necklace. A few faded memories. A grandmother who loved her fiercely but always avoided certain questions. And now suddenly the most powerful man she had ever met was standing in front of her looking at her like she was the only thing keeping him alive. Why did nobody tell me? Naomi whispered. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Evelyn stepped closer carefully. Because once people with money and power start looking for something, they do not stop. Alexander lowered his head painfully. I would never have hurt her. Evelyn nodded through tears. I know that now. But 20 years ago, I did not know who around you could be trusted. Alexander looked exhausted suddenly. Not physically, spiritually. Like carrying guilt for 2 decades had hollowed him out from the inside. I searched every year, he whispered. Every birthday. Naomi looked at him silently. Alexander slowly reached into his suit jacket again, this time pulling out something smaller. Folded carefully inside worn leather was a tiny handmade birthday card decorated with uneven crayon stars faded by time. Naomi frowned slightly. What is that? Alexander's fingers trembled gently as he opened it. Inside, written in childish handwriting, were the words, I love you, Daddy, forever. Naomi stared at the card as another memory flashed violently through her mind. Tiny. Crayons scattered across a kitchen counter. Small hands covered in glitter glue. A deep laugh behind her while someone pretended not to peek at the card before it was finished. Naomi covered her mouth instantly as tears spilled free. Oh my God, she whispered shakily. Alexander could not stop crying anymore either. The billionaire who once intimidated world leaders now stood openly broken in the middle of a crowded restaurant, tears running down his face beneath the amber lights, while strangers silently watched his heart come apart. But grief does not care about pride. Not real grief. It strips people down to whatever truth remains underneath. And Alexander Whitmore had only one truth left. Her. Slowly, carefully, he took another step toward Naomi. I know I cannot get those years back, he whispered. I know I missed birthdays and graduations and every moment that mattered. Naomi's breathing became uneven again. She could see the pain inside him now. Not performative. Not dramatic. Real. The kind of pain that changes the shape of a person permanently. Alexander's voice broke completely. But there was not one single day I stopped looking for you. Silence swallowed the room again. Even the storm outside seemed quieter somehow. Naomi looked down at the little crown necklace resting against her chest, then back at the man standing before her. For 20 years, she had believed she was invisible in this world. Too ordinary to matter. Too small to be searched for. But this man had crossed oceans, hired investigators, and spent 2 decades refusing to bury hope. All for her. Alexander suddenly dropped to his knees. Gasps rippled through Bellamy's instantly. A billionaire kneeling on the polished marble floor before a black waitress still wearing her server apron. But Alexander no longer cared about appearances, or cameras, or power. His eyes stayed fixed on Naomi as tears streamed freely down his face. I searched for you for 20 years, he whispered shakily. My little queen. The entire restaurant stood still as Alexander Whitmore knelt on the marble floor beneath the warm amber lights of Bellamy's rooftop dining room. Rain slid down the towering windows. Behind him, while the Chicago skyline shimmered through the storm like a painting blurred by tears. Nobody touched their food anymore. Nobody checked their phones. Even the piano player had stopped completely, hands frozen above the keys while silence wrapped around the room like a held breath. Naomi stared down at the man before her, unable to fully process what she was seeing. For years, she had watched wealthy men sit at tables like kings, speaking to staff without eye contact, treating kindness like weakness and service workers like furniture. But this man, one of the richest people in America, was kneeling in front of her with tears in his eyes and grief in his voice. Not because he had lost money, not because he had lost power, because he had lost her. Naomi's chest tightened painfully. Every memory surfacing inside her now felt sharper than before. Tiny moments she once thought were dreams suddenly carried weight and shape and meaning. A lakeside dock at sunset. A deep laugh echoing through a giant kitchen. Strong arms lifting her into the air while she squealed with laughter. And always that voice calling her the same thing over and over again. My little queen. Naomi slowly dropped to her knees too, directly in front of him. Gasps spread quietly across the room again. Alexander looked up at her like he could barely believe she was real. Naomi reached out carefully, her trembling fingers touching the side of his face for the first time. The billionaire closed his eyes instantly, leaning into her hand like a man who had spent 20 years starving for proof that hope had not betrayed him after all. "You really looked for me?" Naomi whispered through tears. Alexander nodded immediately. "Every single day." His voice cracked again. "There was never a birthday I forgot. Never a Christmas. Never a year I stopped believing you were alive somewhere." Naomi could not stop crying anymore either. Not because she felt angry, not even because she felt lost, but because for the first time in her life, she understood something profound. She had always believed she was unwanted, forgotten, invisible. Yet somewhere in this massive world, a father had spent 20 years, refusing to give up on her existence. Evelyn stood nearby, quietly weeping into trembling hands while several restaurant guests openly wiped tears from their own eyes. Human beings pretend power is what moves the world. It is not. Love does. Always love. Naomi looked down at the tiny crown necklace resting against her chest before speaking softly. "I used to wonder why Grandma never let me take this off." Alexander smiled through tears for the first time all night. "Because your mother gave it to you 2 days before the fire." Naomi's breath caught again. "My mother." Alexander nodded slowly, grief softening his face once more. "She died 6 months after you disappeared." The pain in his eyes nearly broke Naomi's heart all over again. 20 years. 20 years carrying grief on opposite sides of the same city, without knowing the other was still breathing. Naomi suddenly wrapped her arms around him. Alexander froze for half a second before holding her back carefully, like he was terrified she might vanish if he held too tightly. Rain thundered softly against the windows while Bellamy's rooftop remained silent around them. No cameras, no business deals, no power plays. Just a father and daughter finding each other again beneath the glow of chandelier light and storm clouds over Chicago. And in that moment, every billionaire in the room understood something money could never buy. The most valuable thing Alexander Whitmore ever recovered was not a company or a fortune. It was the waitress everyone else had overlooked.